That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
I was born too late to answer the question, where were you when man landed on the moon? But I was born just in time to witness another cultural touchstone. For gamers at least. The release of Ocarina of Time. I had just turned 5 years old when Ocarina came out, a time when my personality and memories were still taking form. But I have one distant recollection of my mum and younger brother gathering around the television to watch my dad pilot a little green-hooded character on the screen. No doubt we all weighed in as a family to help solve dungeon puzzles or figure out where to go next. Mum was famously good at calling out when to sneak past the guards in Hyrule Castle, while I was good at gormlessly watching the adventure unfold, enraptured by the sweeping music and the fairy dust of Kokiri Forest. As it turns out, I'm not the only one with fond memories of Ocarina of Time. If you turn to blog posts, YouTube videos and their comment sections, you'll find hundreds of people participating in the time-honoured tradition of sharing their nostalgia over this 25-year-old game. You might hear stories of wistful players renting and re-renting the same game cartridge at Blockbuster while praying that no one deleted their save file, or a group of friends all working together to hunt down the infamous secret dungeon under the ice of Zora's domain. Each and every one of these tales is told with a sincere warmth. Behind these words, you can sense each author closing their eyes to better visualise the very first time they watched Link ride Epona under the moonlight. And for some reason, I've recently found myself gleaning more value from these intimate recounts over the swathes of critical analysis pieces that have now picked the bones of Ocarina's game design clean. Everyone knows about the merits of Z-targeting and how much the water temple sucks. What I can't seem to get enough of is hearing how much the game means to someone. These personal anecdotes attempt to communicate how Ocarina has transcended beyond its identity as the highest rated video game of all time into something deeply spiritual to a generation of players. While I've always enjoyed communing around the social campfire of Ocarina of Time to enjoy the warmth of shared nostalgia, I wanted to find out why that was the case. What is it about this game that summons such a potent and personal dose of nostalgia to so many of us? And what is the key part of this game's mystique that makes people feel so compelled to share their most intimate stories about it? I think the key to understanding this lies in our past and our relationship with how and why we remember our memories. But first, it wouldn't seem fair to talk about our esteemed memories of Ocarina of Time without first sharing the holy moment in the game that never fails to make my heart swell. Perhaps some of you will be familiar with it. About a third of the way through Link's heroic adventure, you return to the Temple of Time. The 3 gemstone keys you fought hulking monsters for float from your pockets onto the nearby altar as you play a sacred song the fleeing Princess Zelda taught you in a dream just moments prior. An ancient set of doors slide open to reveal a new chamber with a single artifact in the centre. The Master Sword, the blade of evil's bane, the iconic weapon that adorns the franchise's logo, is now yours for the taking. Link approaches the sword in the stone, readies his grip, and then pulls skyward. Blue light engulfs him as the camera pulls up and away from Link, then further and further away from the character we've been playing as for the last couple of hours, because when we're given back control of Link, he's not the same. In the blink of an eye, 7 years have passed. Link's boyish innocence has transformed into sharp maturity. This is you now, the game implies, handing back to you an avatar that looks and sounds like you. But is it? I've always loved this sequence, because every time I see it, I share that moment with Link. We both dream about the future, and wonder who we'll be in 7 years' time. It's enough to make you wonder, how much can a person change in just a little under a decade? You may be familiar with the old medical myth that every 7 years, all the cells in your body will have regenerated. The fabric of atoms that make you, have all lived, died, and been replaced several times over. Of course, this concept has been generally disproven, but still, it offers up a fun piece of mental chewing gum. Are you really the same person you were 7 years ago, after all that internal change? In a similar vein, have you ever looked back at old photos of yourself with a sense of detachment, You can't deny the person in the photo is you, but it's almost like you're looking at a stranger. Do you still share that person's hopes and dreams? In my eyes, no piece of media has reflected on these thoughts as thoroughly as the documentary film 7 Up. Way back in 1964, a group of British filmmakers set out to interview 14 different 7-year-olds about their lives, their interests, and their ambitions. Children from a span of social backgrounds were all selected for the project, from private boarding school boys to kids living in a children's home. As we watch, we chuckle at the kids' naivety and innocence. Many parrot the opinions of their parents and give unintentionally hilarious answers to the interviewers' questions.
I like my newspaper because I've got shares in it and I know every day what the shares are.
It's a cutesy slice of life film that's unremarkable on its own. What is remarkable is when the filmmakers returned to these children 7 years later in 1970 to ask them all the same questions to produce a new film. Then they returned in 1977, then again in 1984, and then every 7 years up until 2019, when the subjects were 63 years old. Now spanning 6 decades and 9 films, the scope of the Up documentary series is honestly staggering. The focus of each new film is to see how much a person's life has changed after 7 years. Sometimes we revisit someone and it's business as usual. Life trundles along its course. But occasionally we flash forward and find them in near unrecognisable circumstances. At 21, Susie sits coolly with the composure of a 70s film star, holding a cigarette as if it was born into her hand. She confesses no interest in marriage or children.
I'm not very children-minded at the moment. I don't know if I ever will be.
Blink, and she's 28, wearing cardigans, married to a solicitor, has 2 kids, and lives away from the hustle and bustle of the big city. The rather cynical original goal of the project was to make a series of films that chronicle how social class would help determine your lot in life. But over the course of the years, it morphed from being something analytical into something spiritual. It's charming to watch these little coffee catch-up meetings with them as we learn where life has taken them. But the true value of the series is how it makes us hyper-aware of time's inescapable influence on our lives. In his review of the series, critic Roger Ebert puts it best. To look at these films is to meditate on the astonishing fact that man is the only animal that knows it lives in time. Watching a life unfold as a subject physically ages and emotionally matures is an innately fascinating thing to observe. As each chapter goes by, we see these kids grow older and watch their hairlines slowly recede and their wrinkles get ever deeper. Teenage awkwardness melts into the bravado of young adulthood, then morphs again into middle-aged contentment and complacency. Watching these films asks us to look inwards and reconcile how the sea change of personhood is as inevitable as the passage of time. Looking back at any piece of old media about ourselves is a bittersweet thing. We recall our bodies, our faces, and our own journey through life and the thousands of tiny choices and experiences that have led us to where and who we are today. To that end, many of the subjects of the Up documentaries muse about the purpose of the programme. Some of them eventually skirt towards a beautiful answer, a means of capturing the continuity of identity.
The idea of looking at a bunch of people over time and how they evolve, that was a really nifty idea. It isn't a picture really of the essence of Nick. Who is to say what? It's a picture of every man. It's how a person, any person, how they change.
The films could never paint a complete picture of an individual. They instead offer a snapshot of a person's life, a point of reference to record how each individual has changed between pulls of the Master Sword. Each film presents an echo of a person, a soul that's gradually changing physically, but is always based on their original self. A quote from Aristotle is spoken at the beginning of each film. "Give me a child until he is 7, and I will show you the man." There is certainly more truth to this aphorism than the filmmakers could have originally anticipated. Listen closely to some of these subjects, and occasionally you'll still hear their 7-year-old self speaking. Aristotle's quote wouldn't have sounded out of place had the great Deku Tree whispered it at the beginning of Ocarina of Time. Even at a tender age, Link's courage and virtue could be sensed by the ancient tree, so he's called to adventure. Once Link becomes an adult, he's still true to himself and is still fundamentally the same character to control. He still swings a sword, rolls around, and breaks pottery just like he used to. Blink, and he's the same, but different. Both Ocarina of Time and the Up documentaries invite us to consider our own place on life's timeline and subtly ask the question, who were you when you were 7, 14, or 21 years old? If you went back in time by 7 years to tell your younger self about your life now, would they believe you? While both deal in the universal topic of time and aging, Ocarina concerns itself mostly with a slightly more wistful and inherently nostalgic theme, how we gradually transition away from childhood. I wished I was older is a phrase I'm willing to bet a lot of us said at some point in our childhoods. I certainly did. I dreamed of staying up late, not going to school, and doing whatever I wanted. I mean, that's what adults do, right? Imagine the power trip Ocarina of Time provided by letting me pluck the Master Sword to become a cool adult. Of course, the sad irony that was lost on me, and countless other children, is that all adults wish for is to be kids again. To be nostalgic about our childhoods involves muting the unpleasantries and amping up the good stuff. Being happy, being innocent, and living a life that was unburdened with the responsibilities of adulthood. Ocarina's time travel mechanic does wonders highlighting this disparity by allowing us to cultivate a relatable short-term nostalgia for the game's world and its characters. While Link is a child, the game makes liberal use of familiar fairy tale iconography to lull players into a cosy fantasy world. Kokiri Forest is inhabited with children who never grow up, just like Peter Pan's Neverland. Magic beans that sprout near instantly pay homage to Jack and the Beanstalk, and hosting a dungeon inside the belly of a whale is a clear nod to Pinocchio. Subconsciously, we fondly smile as we remember these callbacks, each of them reminding us what childhood wonderment felt like. However, the world always has other plans, and your childhood can't last forever. Shortly after completing the first dungeon, you're sent on your grand adventure. You turn your back on your friends and venture out into the big daunting world to fulfill a destiny that you're still too young to fully comprehend. While travelling between new and intimidating environments, it's easy to draw emotional parallels to our own youthful periods of transition that we've had to face head-on without instructions, like changing schools, going through puberty, or moving house. Link's world is constantly expanding, and home feels further away with every step. While young Link's portion is defined by farewells, adult Link's quest is personified by dissonant homecomings. Stepping out into the market square for the first time presents a bleak reality, a dangerous world full of responsibilities and uncertainty, a clear metaphor for anyone who's been forced to grow up quickly. You might even feel a pang of phantom pain as you open up your inventory as adult Link to find some of your gear is unusable. Your slingshot, boomerang and masks are all greyed out, as Link perhaps knows when it's time to put away childish things. Even though you can always return to childhood by replacing the Master Sword, the burden of your newfound responsibilities always linger in the back of your mind. Towns and villages that once bustled with life are now abandoned. Only the sound of your footsteps ring out in the emptiness where your friends once stood. Arriving back at Kokiri Forest in particular makes you ruminate on a very personal revelation. Did everything always look this small? Though the geometry of the world is consistent, everywhere you look has the subtle markings of time's erosion. Noticing these changes is akin to the sensation of returning to your hometown over the Christmas holidays. You take note of the trees that have been removed and the businesses that have changed hands, each time silently mourning a small part of your personal history that's been lost to time. The game rarely tips its hand to explain this subtext explicitly. It's content to let the player marinate in its world and experience these feelings organically. We emotionally connect with Link's in-game quest to save this land because we share his reverence for the people, the nature, the happiness. The emotions we feel about Ocarina are all the more intimate and honest because, while digital, Hyrule feels like a tangible place within the realm of our recollections. We can remember the pathways and the geography of the land, as if recalling the rooms of the houses we used to live in. Ocarina's theming heightens our awareness of transition, both inside and out of the game's world. And in doing so, just like the moon landings, many players can set their watch to when they first played it. They can recall a summer holiday of playing the game non-stop with friends, or how Zelda acted as a welcome reprieve during a period of turbulent home life. Consequently, when we remember Ocarina nowadays, players don't simply feel the implied nostalgia from the in-game theming. They're nostalgic for occupying that space, adventuring across the vast field of Hyrule, and feeling a certain way at a specific point in time. But what does it look like to remember a memory? Well, ever the sentimentalist, my mum has recently picked up painting again, and her latest interest is recreating old photographs of my brother and me. Where a photo offers an almost perfect glimpse of a moment, a painting offers an interpretation of that scene. What I find most interesting about her work is what truths she's decided to replicate onto the canvas, and what details she omits or alters. Coupled with her gently impressionistic style, the end result captures the feeling of trying to remember that moment. A good chunk of Fred Davis's book, Yearning for Yesterday, is dedicated to trying to define nostalgia's metaphysical qualities and how they're portrayed across different art forms. He describes how paintings with nostalgic theming often depict a snapshot of a memory, where the most vivid part has definition, while the borders and backgrounds present a space that's more textural than tangible. Literature accomplishes a similar goal, not just by using hazy prose, but with sparse, yet deliberate wording, thus evoking memories of speech and soundbites that just barely ring out in the annals of our memories. Nostalgia is even conveyed through the physicality of dance, as choreographers and performers employ slower, more ethereal movements, as if to communicate how one would glide through a trance. And of course, music uses soothing melodies that echo hauntingly to express yearning for a time long past. I've already discussed how Ocarina employs a lot of these techniques to code the game with nostalgia, but now, 25 years after the game's initial release, the game lives on in our collective memories, because now it unintentionally looks, sounds, and plays like how nostalgia feels. A lot of that comes down to the fact it's an early 3D adventure game running on 64-bit hardware. It was a cutting-edge trailblazer for '98, but now it's charmingly lo-fi. Returning to the game, you might notice that Link's movement is a little stiff, and jumping has an uncanny weightlessness. Coupled with the fact the original game ran at 20 frames per second, controlling Link can now feel like wading through a daydream. The low-res textures now take on an ethereal quality after being stretched and smeared across the world's frequently abstract geometry. The occasional pre-rendered backgrounds are also deliciously liminal. They somehow occupy a space that's simultaneously hyper-detailed yet sparse, built with a dream logic that lacks tactility and feels unnerving thanks to its stillness. The N64 lacked a dedicated sound chip as well, which hamstrung its audio quality, but it's hard to deny the continued legacy of the game's soundtrack that's lingered on in so many memories. The soundscape itself is perfectly personified by the eponymous ocarina, an instrument with a sound profile that's sometimes playful, sometimes mournful, but always distant. But none of this ever detracts from the experience. If anything, Ocarina of Time, alongside many titles from the N64 and PS1 era, carry an aesthetic that's aged with a different kind of grace. It's a look that's become revered in the hearts of many gamers, because like the aura of MTV music videos, Disney VHS tapes, or early internet web pages, it's become synonymous with a time and place. I'm certainly not alone in loving these classic renders from late 90s Nintendo games. Twitter is awash with these little nostalgia nuggets, each one evoking memories of poring through the instruction manuals and strategy guides of yesteryear. Some have even appropriated the distinctive style of these games to create their own works. Notably, Pseudo Regalia or Crow Country are modern titles that play around with this very niche visual flavour. But perhaps my favourite example is OnForward's project OK Nintendo 64, a complete fan remake of Radiohead's OK Computer, while exclusively using the N64's sound font. All of these endeavours speak to a key aspect of nostalgia that Fred Davis brings up again in his book, the search for one's secret or true self by turning to the past for answers. We keep diving back into the ocean of our memory to dredge up uncovered secrets about who we were, some piece of the puzzle of our identity that we've been clamouring for our whole lives. In a similar way, we constantly push back against the finite state of these games. Playground rumours of a hidden Zelda dungeon cemented the idea that somewhere there's a stone we left unturned, or a secret that we've been missing after all this time. By delving back into Ocarina, or any piece of media that pays tribute to it, we try to make sense of why it holds such a power over us. To several players, myself included, the N64 aesthetic is almost inseparable from what nostalgia looks like in our minds. Ocarina's blocky character models, the two-dimensional sprites used for foliage, and the mesmerising use of a moving texture on a cavern wall to create the illusion of water's reflection. It all provides a unique feeling of comfort capable of transporting us back to our childhoods, but it also induces us into an introspective headspace where we hope to better reconnect and understand ourselves. While the software is showing signs of age, nothing can stop the fact the game's hardware is gradually decaying. Over the years, I've learned to make my peace with the fact that my own physical copy of the game is transient. One day, the inexpensive and mass-produced chipset that's encased in plastic from the 90s will cease to function, and I find it oddly fitting that a cartridge that I always thought looked like a gravestone will eventually entomb the greatest game of all time. In the shorter term, many N64 cartridges that use internal save files rely on a small battery to power that memory. The life cycle of those batteries is about 15 to 20 years, so in a poetically tragic kind of way, there's a good chance the game's own memory has been erased by time. But that doesn't have to mean our own memories of playing will go with it. The Learning Games Initiative Research Archive, or LGIRA for short, is an Arizona-based organisation dedicated to games preservation. The museum itself has a more abstract ethos to games conservation that I can't help but feel totally charmed by. The operative principle for the LGIRA is that deep human memory of the archive's artefacts can be more timeless and accurate than less experiential forms of study. In many important respects, memory, particularly when its contents are shared widely and deeply, is far more durable than what most game-related artefacts are constructed from. The LGIRA mantra is not use rather than preservation, but use as preservation. And you know what's kinda beautiful? We're sharing those memories widely and deeply already, especially when it comes to Ocarina. Through YouTube, through essays, and through word of mouth, we keep things alive in the conscious world by telling our stories about them, preserving not only the game's legacy, but also our individual history and our own memories of experiencing the game for the very first time. The problem with memory is that it's famously unreliable, but this is why I value people's stories about Ocarina so dearly. Hearing them is like reminiscing about the past with friends, that mystical, time-travelling activity that brings me closer to my own recollections and unsmears the textures in my own visual memory. The stories we tell and retell about Zelda are the building blocks of our personal history, and sharing these memories helps us articulate the game's impact on defining who we are today. Many players speak about how the game helped determine their relationship with life and death, or taught them how to face their fears head-on just like Link, or how to accept the sometimes cruel passage of time. When I replay Ocarina of Time, I cherish the music, the characters, and the world. But if I look beyond the surface level of my rose-tinted recollections, I realise what I really yearn for is time spent with my family and my capacity for wonderment, things that as I've gotten older, I've learned not to take for granted. Only with hindsight does this kind of self-examination occur, and I think this touches on the humble purpose of nostalgia. It shines a light on who we were, and by extension, who we are now. Our friend Fred Davis writes it plainly. Nostalgia, like long-term memory, like reminiscence, like daydreaming, is deeply implicated in the sense of who we are and what we are about. In short, nostalgia is one of the means we employ in the never-ending work of constructing, maintaining, and reconstructing our identities. To look back with nostalgia is to take a peek into your past, glimpse into the tapestry of your being, and decide which atoms to keep and which to throw away. We are the living product of that ongoing subconscious process to preserve the continuity of our identity, and games like Ocarina of Time resummon and recontextualize those fragments of our personhood we almost forgot about, so we can better understand ourselves. While Ocarina relishes in its themes of time passing, its greatest and unintentional effect is how it now acts as a time capsule to reconnect us to our younger selves so we can take stock in how we've changed. A few notes of a song or a fleeting glimpse of the title screen is often all it takes to send those who love the game down Ocarina's memory lane. Its path is speckled with oddly shaped trees and chunky polygons, but it's a cosy space that permits us to enjoy the memories of our wonder years. But nostalgia never mockingly asks, "Don't you miss the good old days?" It asks a much more philosophical question. How long have you been the person you are today? The changes we all endure as we transition between the stages of life feel so gradual as we live through them that they almost feel invisible. It's only when we look back at ourselves through our photographs, home videos, and the media we cherish that we realise how different we are now to our past selves. Nostalgia is a warm emotion, often tinged with melancholy. It forces us to look inwards, to smile at the good times and bow our heads as we remember a part of ourselves that has been lost. But there's a third emotion tucked away in there: optimism, a hope that we can reclaim some essence of ourselves that has drifted away. The world is constantly changing, and none of us are the same people we were when we were 7 years old. But that's a truth we shouldn't mourn, but celebrate. Nostalgia makes you consider not just the past, but also all that time between then and now. We are animals that know we live in time. We have the capacity to see our history, our choices, and our experiences, and use them as an opportunity for growth. We can fully see this in motion in Zelda too. Adult Link's world may seem destitute at first, but his actions restore the world, shaping it ever closer to the world he once knew as a child. We can use the past as our teacher, taking with it the knowledge to improve ourselves, our environment, and maybe even one day, our children's opportunities. Sharing our nostalgia, like so many of us have done with this 25-year-old game, is one of the many ways we can verbalise these introspective revelations so they can begin existing outside our heads and become a catalyst for personal change. None of us own time machines, but my N64 is the next best thing. Thrusting my copy of Ocarina of Time into the cartridge slot mirrors Link's movement to return the Master Sword to its pedestal, an act that can return both of us to a simpler era. When I look at the screen, I'm reminded of who I was when I input my name all those years ago. When I look down at the controller, I see the hands of who I am now. Then when the time inevitably comes in our quest to once again pluck the Master Sword, I share that moment with Link all over again and wonder who I'll be in 7 years' time.